Hey Baker Babes, coming from outside of my patio because it's so nice outside today. I'm going to read to you a little bit of Mrs. Pigglewiggle this afternoon. Hope you're having a nice day, and I hope you're spending some of this time outside. We even did a little bit of our learning outside today because it was so nice. That night when Melody kissed her mommy and daddy goodnight, she said, "I'm never going to cry again, no matter what happens, not ever." And she never did. And at Trent and Tansy Popsicle's birthday party, Melody and Betsy Wilt were in the Ferris wheel, and something happened to the motor, and the Ferris wheel stopped and wouldn't start. And there they were at the very top. Both little girls were awfully scared, but when Betsy began to cry, Melody said, "Crying never helped anything, Betsy. As long as we're up so high, let's see if we can see our houses. Look, way over there, past the sawmill chimney, and right up behind the school. Isn't that your house?" Betsy wiped her eyes on her sleeve and looked where Melody was pointing, and sure enough, it did look like her house. Then she noticed that she could see Little Willow Lake. Then she saw the building where her father worked, and then they both thought they saw Melody's house. "And I think I see my kitten Butterball asleep on the garage roof," Melody said. Just then, the Ferris wheel started. When they got off, Mr. Popsicle was waiting for them. He said, "What, no tears? By George, such bravery deserves an ice cream soda. What flavor will it be, ladies?" "I'll take chocolate with chocolate ice cream," Melody said. "Me too," said Betsy. "I've already had strawberry and vanilla." While they were eating their sodas, Mr. Popsicle said, "I thought girls always cried when they were scared." "I did cry," Betsy said, "but Melody said that crying never helped anything." "It doesn't either," Melody said. "I know, because I used to cry a lot when I was littler." Mrs. Pigglewiggle is a genius. Chapter 3, The Bully. Nicholas Semicolon was 10 years old. He was a husky boy, very strong and large for his age. All parents like to have large, healthy children, and Mr. and Mrs. Semicolon would have been very proud of Nicholas except for one thing. One shameful thing. Nicholas was a bully. He hit children littler than he was. He teased and hit girls. He teased and hit puppy dogs. He scared cats. He even threw stones at birds, and once he tipped over the stroller of a 1-year-old baby left outside the grocery store. For a long time, Mr. and Mrs. Semicolon didn't know about Nicholas. They knew he was large for his age. They knew his friendships with other children didn't last very long. They knew he had not been asked to several birthday parties, but they thought that Nicholas was big and strong and handsome, and needed older, more intelligent children to play with. In fact, just the night before this story opens, just the night before this story opens, after Nicholas had kicked the cat, stepped on Josephine, the dog's tail, and gone swaggering out to bed, Mrs. Semicolon said to Mr. Semicolon, "Forthright, have you noticed how fine and big and strong a little Nicky has grown?" Mr. Semicolon, who was reading about stocks and bonds in the evening paper, said, "Sure outgrows his shoes fast. 2 new pairs last month." "I know," said Mrs. Semicolon dreamily. "His feet are just enormous. They're almost as big as yours." "Good," said Mr. Semicolon, brightening up. "Maybe he can wear out those oxblood brogues I got in Chicago last winter. They never did fit, and I paid a lot for 'em." "Do boys wear brogues?" said Mr. Semicolon. "What difference does it make?" said Mr. Semicolon. "They're shoes, and they're new. After all, Abe Lincoln went barefoot." "But Forthright, dear," said Mrs. Semicolon anxiously, "Nicky is a patrol boy, and he needs new patrol boots. I have a challenge for you, Baker Babes. I want you, when you're done listening to this story, type in the word brogues in your dictionary, or look it up in a dictionary you might have at home. It's spelled BROGUES. Now, we've been able to use our dictionary before, so I want you to see, 1, how do you say it? Remember, a dictionary can tell us how to pronounce things. And 2, what does it mean? And I want you to write to me and tell me. Deal? Oop, I probably should have held it down a little bit farther so you could see it easier. That's meat old Nicholas. I don't know if you guys can see this, but Ivy is enjoying the... Oh, there she goes. Ivy, you want to say hi to the 2nd graders? She's been enjoying this weather, too. Nonsense, said Mr. Semicolon. Shoes are shoes. They're only meant to keep your feet off the cold ground. The next morning, rather hesitantly, Mrs. Semicolon went into Nicholas's room carrying the large, sturdy brogues. She said, "Look what Daddy got in Chicago, dear." Nicholas took one of the shoes, examined it carefully, and then to his mother's surprise said, "Zowie, what strong shoes! Can I wear them to school today?" "I was thinking more of Sunday school," said his mother, "but I guess one day at school won't matter." Nicholas, who was still in his pajamas, slipped a bare foot into one of the shoes. He smiled happily. "Kind of big, but boy, they're strong and heavy." "Come on outside. Come on. You don't need to be in the bedroom." She's being a bad dog. She needs to come outside and enjoy the weather. I think she might just sit there in the doorway. Nicholas, who was still in his pajamas, slipped a bare foot into one of the shoes. He smiled happily. "Kind of big, but boy, are they strong and heavy." Mrs. Semicolon heaved a sigh of relief and went downstairs to make the pancakes. When Nicholas came clumping into breakfast, Mr. Semicolon said, "New shoes, eh, son?" "Yeah," said Nicholas, "new and strong. I bet if I kicked with these old shoes, I would just about break somebody's leg." Mr. Semicolon, who was reading the paper and not listening, said, "Mm-hmm." Mrs. Semicolon, who was turning the pancakes, said, "How many sausages, Nicky, dear?" 10 sausages and 14 pancakes, said Nicholas, gulping down his orange juice. "My, what a big, strong, hungry boy you are," said his mother happily. "Oh, no, thank you." Go get your ball. Hold on one second, Baker babes. Okay. Then breakfast was over, and Nicholas had gone clumping off to school in his new shoes. It really didn't fit. And Mr. Semicolon had left for the office in his new shoes that did. Mrs. Semicolon poured herself a hot cup of coffee and sat down at the telephone to call up her friends. She had finished talking to Mary Hex when the telephone rang. It was little Roscoe Eager's mother, and she was so mad she was choking. She said, "Carlotta Semicolon, if you don't do something about that big bully, I'm going to call the sheriff." "What big bully?" asked Mrs. Semicolon innocently. "What big bully?" shrieked Mrs. Eager. "You know perfectly well what big bully." "I don't either," said Mrs. Semicolon. "I don't know any big bullies." "Oh, yes, you do," said Mrs. Eager, because the biggest, meanest, cruelest bully in the whole United States is your own son, Nicholas Semicolon." "You mean my Nicky?" asked Mrs. Semicolon. "Yes, your Nicky," said Mrs. Eager. "This morning on his way to school, he kicked little Roscoe in the shins with his new big shoes, and now Roscoe's home, lying on the davenport with bandages clear up to his knees, and his legs are still bleeding, and for all I know, both leg bones are shattered." Do you know what a davenport is? My grandma actually calls her couch a davenport. That's what they're talking about. The little boy's laying on their couch, and the people used to call it a davenport. Did you know that? I only know that because of a connection I made with my grandma. "How horrible!" wailed Mrs. Semicolon. "How terrible! Shall I call the doctor?" "I already have," said Mrs. Eager coldly. "He's on his way over. But what I want to know is what you intend to do about Nicholas." "I'll punish him, of course," said Mrs. Semicolon. "But I just can't understand it. It doesn't sound a bit like Nicky." "But it does," said Mrs. Eager. "It sounds exactly like him. Hitting children littler than he is, kicking dogs, jerking toys away from babies, tipping over little girls' tricycles, pulling cats' tails. Now I have to go. I hear Roscoe moaning for me." "Jessie, dear, I am so sorry," said Mrs. Semicolon. "I'll come right over and bring some coloring books and some sugar cookies I baked yesterday." At first, after she hung up the phone, Mrs. Semicolon cried a little. And then she remembered the new brogues, blew her nose, wiped her eyes, and called Mr. Semicolon. When he answered, she said angrily, "Well, I hope you're happy." "About what?" he asked. Mrs. Semicolon began to cry. "It's those old brogues. It didn't fit Nicky anyway," she sobbed. "What in the world is the matter?" said Mr. Semicolon. So Mrs. Semicolon told him about Mrs. Eager's telephone call. Mrs. Semicolon said, "It never would have happened if it hadn't been for those brogues. I'm going to give them to Goodwill." Mr. Semicolon said, "Listen to me, Carlotta dear. It is not the shoes that are at fault. It is Nicky. After all, the shoes didn't grab his feet and force him to kick a little boy in the shins, did they?" "No, I guess not," sniffed Mrs. Semicolon. "Well then," said Mr. Semicolon, "the important thing is not the kind of shoes he kicked with, is the fact that he kicked, and a boy smaller than he. Isn't that right, dear?" "Yes," said Mrs. Semicolon. "Well then," said Mr. Semicolon, "when young Nicholas comes home from school, you send him up to his room to think things over, and I'll deal with him when I come home." Then Mrs. Semicolon remembered about kicking the dogs, jerking toys away from babies, tipping over little girls' tricycles, pulling cats' tails. So she said, "But kicking with the brogues isn't the only thing forthright. Mrs. Eager also told me," and she told him all the rest of Nicky's bad actions. When she had finished, Mr. Semicolon said, "I won't have a bully for a son. I think I'll go over to the school right now and deal with that young man." "What will you do?" asked Mrs. Semicolon faintly. There was a pause, quite a long pause on the other end of the wire, and then Nicky's father said, "Why don't you call Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle?" "Oh, Forthright, how clever of you," said Nicky's mother. "I'll call her right away. She'll know just what to do. She always does." A few minutes later, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, who was out in her backyard gathering hazelnuts for her 2 gray squirrels, Taylor and Filbert, heard the phone ring. When she picked it up and said hello, the voice on the other end was so sad and ashamed when it said, "Hello, Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle," that she knew at once who it was. And Mrs. Semicolon started to tell her about Nicky's kicking and hitting and jerking and pushing and tripping little children. But Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said in her very gentle voice, "I know, Mrs. Semicolon. You don't have to tell me. I know all about it." "Do you mean the other mothers have called you up?" said Mrs. Semicolon. "No, no," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "but Nicky has been coming over here to play for a long time. I've watched him grow from a rather sickly, weak child to a fine, strong, healthy boy. You should be proud of him, Mrs. Semicolon." "I was," said Mrs. Semicolon, "until this morning. Now, after what I've heard, I wish he was sickly and weak still." "Not really," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "It's much nicer to have a fine, healthy son. Easier, too. All you want is to have Nicky behave in as fine and strong as a way as he looks." "What I don't understand," said Mrs. Semicolon, "is why Nicky should act in this dreadful way he does. Neither his father or I have ever bullied him." "Of course you haven't," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "Neither have I, but he acts the same way down here. And if it's any comfort to you, so did Billy McIntosh until last week when his mother gave him bully baths." "What in the world are they?" said Mrs. Semicolon. "They're just an evening bath with a little weakening powder sprinkled in them. With each bath, the bully gets weaker and weaker until finally, as in the case of Billy McIntosh, his 2-year-old brother could push him down and sit on him." "Is he all right now?" asked Mrs. Semicolon. "Just fine," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "How wonderful," said Mrs. Semicolon. "Shall I start the bully baths tonight?" "I was just thinking," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "In the case of Nicholas, I'm not sure the bully baths would be the right cure." "But why?" asked Mrs. Semicolon. "They work with Billy McIntosh." "I know they did," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "but Billy McIntosh has little sisters and brothers. No, I think that Nicholas would be better off with leadership pills." "Leadership pills?" asked Mrs. Semicolon. "What are they?" "They're just little green pills that taste like peppermint," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "but they bring out wonderful hidden qualities of leadership, especially in only children. Does Nicholas have a playroom or a place where he can bring his friends?" "Well, he has a very nice bedroom," said Mrs. Semicolon. "I'm sure he has," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle, "but I was thinking more of a place in the cellar or garage or even a tent house in the backyard." "Oh, I know," said Mrs. Semicolon excitedly. "There's a little old studio out in back. It was built for the artist brother of the people who used to live here. We've used it for garden tools and peat moss and the lawnmower, and once Nicholas kept a rabbit there, but we could move the garden tools into the cellar and I could just have it all fixed up for Nicholas." Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle said, "Why not let Nicholas fix it up for himself?" "Do you think he could?" asked Mrs. Semicolon. "Let's wait and see how the leadership pills work," said Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle. "If you will send Nicholas over when he comes home from school, I'll give him a little bottle to bring home. Give him 1 pill every day for a week, but don't expect miracles. The qualities of leadership are not something you attain overnight. Keep in touch and don't worry." The very first thing Mrs. Semicolon did after she hung up the phone was to go out in the yard and look at the old studio. It was late autumn, almost winter, and that little old path that led from the back porch past the parsley patch, around the chrysanthemum bed, under the Gravenstein apple tree, around the strawberry barrel, past the compost pile to the chestnut tree under which was nestled the old studio, was ankle deep in leaves. They made a nice crumpled newspaper sound as Mrs. Semicolon walked through them. The little old studio needed a coat of paint, and the porch was sagging. The front door was hard to open. Inside was the usual gardener's litter: spilled peat moss, empty buckets, coffee cans half filled with bone meal and lime, a broken bamboo rake, the power lawnmower, empty seed packages, empty flower pots, Nicky's first bicycle, his last big tricycle, and a Christmas tree stand. We'll have to find out what happens with Nicky tomorrow. Bye, babes. Love you.